Welcome to the Exploring the Faith YouTube channel. My name is Cole DeSantis, and I'm here today with Andrew Likoudis. Andrew Likoudis is the editor of Faith in Crisis, Critical Dialogues in Catholic Traditionalism, Church Authority and Reform, which deals with a myriad of topics connected with the implications, both ecclesiastical, spiritual, pastoral, of the Second Vatican Council, and in specific, a lot of the debates emerging from the Council. He is an MA candidate in Catholic Studies at Franciscan University. He is the founder and president of the Likoudis Legacy Foundation, a theological research initiative building on the work of his late grandfather, the theologian and apologist James Likoudis, a leading authority on Vatican II, liturgical reform, and the Church's relations to the Eastern Orthodox. Andrew is also an associate member of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars and the Society for Catholic Liturgy. He has written for the National Catholic Register, Where Peter Is, the Catholic Review, and is an editor of 10 books on the papacy and Catholic ecclesiology. So thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to the debate, or the discussion, rather.
Yeah. I hope I'm not debating. I'm not prepared to debate.
Nah. Well, we're going to be talking a lot about other debates that other people are involved in, so... Yeah. But it's the point is for us to sort of analyze it. So let's begin. So a lot of people could probably tell by your book that it's about the notion of the crisis in the church. Maybe this is a term that a lot of people in my audience have heard. This is certainly a phrase that a lot of the people who follow your work and the work of people like you have probably heard. But, maybe we can begin the interview by sort of talking in broad terms about this notion of what is the crisis in the church, and in specific, what is it about the current situation in the church that inspired you to write this work?
Yeah. So I take a little bit of a different tack than some of the other people who've written about the crisis. My point is basically that the crisis is not one that the church has necessarily caused. It's a crisis that the church is dealing with, but I think it's primarily a question of it's a catechetical crisis in large part. So it affects the faith, and it affects the way people relate to their faith. So the book is called Faith in Crisis, which has like a dual meaning. One of it's people's faith in crisis. The other is how to keep faith within the midst of the crisis. Sure. So the book addresses, it gives sort of like a summary of the roots of the crisis, and then it gets into church authority and how Catholics are meant to relate to church authority, how they're meant to, what stance they're meant to take towards the Pope and the bishops, and the different forms of the Magisterium, how they give like assent of intellect and will to different forms of teaching, or whether it's an assent of faith, because there's a difference there. And then we get into the particular reforms that are causing people to question the faith, or to question the church's role of mediating the faith in a postmodern world. So we deal with stuff like the Pachamama ordeal, synodality, religious liberty, ecumenism, things like capital punishment, amoris laetitia, and communion for the divorced and remarried, interreligious dialogue, and there's a whole lot more. We also get into liturgy, and things like media polarization and clickbait. Yeah. So it's really pretty comprehensive. It's not just, I know you said earlier, you made it seem like I'm the author of the book, but I actually invited 30 contributors to offer essays. So it's 40 chapters and 30 contributors. Some of the contributors issued multiple essays, but it's pretty wide ranging. It's like all the authors don't agree on everything, but it's like, it's a dialogue. The book is kind of a dialogue about all of these issues. Yeah.
And so who were some of the people who you decided to include in the book?
So it's it was a complicated task because I was at once trying to address very nuanced topics, but I also wanted to reach a wide audience. So I invited a mix of academic and popular authors. So we have people like Jimmy Akin, Mike Aquilina, Michael Lofton, um, Cardinal Sarah, and we also have people like Robert Fastigi, Raphael Luciani. Raphael's a Pope Francis appointed expert on the synod, so he was appointed by the Pope as one of the people leading the whole global synod. So we're really privileged to have him as a contributor. We also have Gavin DaCosta, who's maybe the leading authority on interreligious dialogue, especially relating to Jews and Muslims in the church. And let's see, my grandfather contributed an essay. This was his last essay on liturgical reform, and then I think we also have Tyler McNabb, Pedro Gabriel, Timothy O'Malley from Notre Dame. It's pretty comprehensive. There's a
Yeah.
lot there. Couldn't list them all from memory. It's too much, but
Yeah. And it was a pretty, in addition to some essays that I believe one or two that you contributed, it was also, I do remember from the book, it was a pretty wide range of authors from a few different perspectives.
mhm.
But, you had mentioned your grandfather, and a lot of people, he's probably best known, at least among more casual followers of theology and apologetics, for his work on the papacy more generally and in Catholic Orthodox relations. But for those who kind of dig a little bit deeper, they'll know that I believe it was back in the 70s, he was one of the first, waves of theologians to really address some of the controversies arising from Vatican II and to sort of like wrestle with these issues and sort of, defend the decrees of the council. And so was there anything specifically in his works that, influenced or inspired you as you were doing research or writing or reaching out to people?
Yeah. So when I started, when this book came about because I was doing a lot to edit and republish his out of print works, and most of what he's written is on the papacy and Eastern Orthodoxy. Um, but when he was coming into his own in the 70s, um, he was doing a lot to defend Humanae Vitae. Um, he a lot of his work was catechetical. He taught a lot on sex education, hosting town halls, defending parental rights, and um, he was also working with CUF, which it's for those who don't know, it's Catholics United for the Faith. CUF is the acronym, and that was a catechetical organization which came about in the 70s or 80s, I believe, um, to stem the tide of dissent following Vatican II, um, both on the liberal side, like the left-leaning Charles Curran, Hans Kung types, as well as to respond to Lefebvre and the SSPX on the other side. So Cuff did a lot of catechetical work in trying to chart sort of a middle path through the chaos. And among other things, my grandfather was known for this catechetical role primarily. So what I wanted to do with my book is to extend that sort of legacy into a new era with addressing the same kinds of confusion. There's a lot of polarization, and there's right and left leaning Catholics who are going at it. Um, but neither of them really has all the answers, and there's a better middle path that I think we need to sort of recover in the mainstream.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, books like yours are important because, for people who are under a certain age, they need to start writing, whether it be more popular or more academic works, to sort of complement what the older generation said, because people like your father or your grandfather rather were writing just as a lot of these issues were just, and a lot of these debates were starting to come to the fore. Whereas, you know, people who are closer to our age are now living, 30, 40, 50 years, 60 years now after the fact. And while a lot of these debates, the basic parameters have still remained, certainly, as you well know, and as a lot of the audience will know, they become compounded. And
Mm-hmm.
what we're starting to see now is an unfolding of the sort of the effects or the consequences, stuff that people were speculating about back in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s is now starting to come to fruition. And so that's why we need to really examine these issues more closely. And even more importantly is looking at, a lot of the roots of these issues. So I guess that's the first of the more, substantive questions. The first one I'd like to pose is probably the broadest and the most foundational. But
Yeah.
how would you define traditionalism? Because people use the term traditionalism as almost like an organized ideology or a movement.
Yeah.
And for the average Catholic, traditionalism may simply sound like, oh, we want to have a strict adherence to tradition, which is not a bad thing. In fact, that's something that all Catholics should want to do. So, what is it about, like, how does traditionalism as a movement differ from simply the desire to adhere to tradition?
Mm-hmm.
And what are its key beliefs and characteristics? Um, and what is it that sometimes makes the traditionalist movement problematic?
Yeah. So I think to understand the traditionalist movement, you really have to go back to the 60s and 70s. Traditionalism was in large part a response to a sort of liberalizing within the church. So the modernist crisis happened under Pope Pius X, and then leading up to Vatican II, you had theologians who continued to promote the historical critical method to the exclusion of other methods of exegesis. And after Vatican II came about, within Vatican II, there were opposing ideological sides. They sort of hammered out the documents, and then each side respectively tried to sort of take advantage of the documents in a way that suited their purposes, but some of them went too far, and sort of it led to a watering down of the faith and um, a crisis of dissent, especially in the 70s when Humanae Vitae was issued. So, with this crisis of dissent, the traditionalist movement arose as a sort of a counteractive or a reaction, which also went too far. But at the time, it it seemed like the more solid and orthodox option because it was responding to um, the chaos, and people didn't really know how to respond to the chaos, so they looked for something stable, and that would seem to be traditionalism. But now the pendulum has sort of swung in the opposite direction, where the traditionalists are falling into the same errors of private interpretation of the tradition to the exclusion of the magisterium's teaching. They're also falling into things like rigorism and rigidity and rejecting teachings outright. And it's ironic because they have become exactly what they were trying to fight in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. And so this actually, dovetailing off of that are two, I think, also very pertinent questions. And one of them is more historical. So can you maybe sketch a little bit about, the history of the traditionalist movement and sort of maybe how it factioned off into a few different camps? Because
Yeah.
there's types of traditionalists who most Christians or Catholics wouldn't necessarily see as problematic, and then there are some who are causing more controversy. So if you can maybe give a little bit of an overview of that.
Yeah, sure. So, um, immediately after the council, Archbishop Lefebvre, who was he originally signed the Vatican II documents, but then he sort of went back on his word, and he had some trouble with John Paul II and Paul VI. He was attempted they attempted to correct him multiple times, but he refused the correction. He said, "Because I don't understand these teachings, I'm going to say that your teaching is wrong, and I I have tradition behind me, so my interpretation must be right." But he sort of missed the part that the magisterium is the authentic interpreter of tradition, and private judgment is not. That's sort of a Protestant idea that he adopted for some reason. Um, but so his movement arose, and then in Brazil there was another movement happening simultaneously in the Diocese of Campos, where I think it's Bishop Meyer was leading a resistance movement, and Archbishop Lefebvre and he sort of colluded to foster this growing schismatic sect, and they consecrated bishops in opposition to the will of John Paul II. And from there were other splinter groups. So you have like uh, Archbishop Archbishop I think his name's Williams. Is that right? He
Yes,
was a
Bishop Williams with he one of the English bishops in the SSPX. Yeah,
Yeah. So he split off from the SSPX and started a splinter SSPX group, and then you have groups like SSPV. Um, you have the Sedevacantists who uh, they have a lot of the same concerns as the SSPX, but instead of saying they submit to the Pope in principle but reject certain of his teachings, they say that we don't think that the Pope is valid at all, so we reject everything from 19 it's usually 1950s or 60s onward. So they think that the papacy has been abdicated for the past 60 years. So you have the SSPX, and then you have the Sedevacantists, and now more recently you have what's called Recognize and Resist, which has picked up on a lot of the same tendencies and errors, the same kind of analysis. They use the same analysis provided by SSPXers and Sedevacantists, but they try to sort of hold in tension their obedience to the church, at least in theory, and their concerns. So they reject certain teachings like on the death penalty, or Pope Francis's change to the catechism on or what was it? Pope Francis's encyclical on communion for the divorced and remarried,
yeah,
um, and the accompanying disciplinary change. Um, they try to hold that intention with their recognition of the Pope. So they accept his authority in principle, but in practice they reject it. Um, the same with like his decisions on liturgical reform. They say his will is, or his teaching is valid, but we don't think it's prudent. Therefore, like we're going to resist it in the newspapers, and like we're going to try to correct him. Um, and that's the same error of private interpretation or dissent in theory in reality.
yeah. And so a lot of the discussions on traditionalism lead to sort of the other main point that I think it's important to really talk about is at what point does tradition become rigorism? Because a lot of people
Mm.
see rigorism as a spiritual or theological tendency, often associated with fundamentalism. So, where precisely does one draw the line between tradition, or even just a broadly traditional stance, and something like a rigorist stance?
Yeah. So I think one of the tendencies of traditionalism is to see anything that looks like liberalism, uh, to view it as with suspicion. So pastoral flexibility might seem like liberalism, or a more merciful approach, or some sort of like compromise on disciplinary um, actions. Um, Traditionalists say that like it's the safer route to be more strict or even harsh in some contexts, because either we've done that in the past, and changing it now sort of compromises the tradition, or um, in order to sort of stay free from sin, we're going to tend towards the most extreme and strict thing possible, which um, there's a whole moral theology behind this, especially with Saint Alphonsus. He taught that like if you have the option between a strict and a lax option, like it's more sacrificial to be more strict. So it's therefore holier, or something along those lines. But there's some truth to that, but the way that it's used to reject things like magisterial teachings and discipline goes way too far. Like that might work for something like whether you should avoid eating meat on Friday, even though you can do something else instead of eating meat in the post-conciliar era, because well, not during Lent, but during the rest of the year, something like that.
And so that's actually very interesting, and I think what we've been talking about so far, how, some forms of traditionalism have a tendency towards, towards rigorism. And I think, you had brought up an interesting point when you had said that anything that even seems to even vaguely remind the person of liberalism is held in suspicion. And so certainly there probably is a certain level of overzealousness involved. But I guess this then begs the question of like sort of stepping back, looking at the bigger sort of historical and cultural context. And for
Mhm.
anyone who out there who knows, about is knowledgeable about church history, especially in the past half a century or so, one of the big concerns, not just for traditionalists, but even for most Catholics trying to be Orthodox, and you had made reference to this, was the notion of ideological radicals in the church misinterpreting or misimplementing or even outright ignoring certain elements of the council for the sake of serving an ideological agenda. And that was, I
Mhm.
think, a big concern, and still is a big concern for a lot of Catholics today. But there was, in some sense, and I think rightfully so, because that's been done a lot to undermine the church, but most of the focus was on that. And I think there wasn't necessarily a sufficient focus on how the sort of opposite tendencies could also go astray. So, in what ways can traditionalism go astray? And you had already kind of like, we had already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but what exactly is it about some of the more radical forms of traditionalism that makes them, you know, uh, deviate from the church? And you had mentioned a few of these issues, like their tendency towards rigorism, the fact that they question the magisterium, which for someone who claims to be traditional seems almost a little bit counterintuitive, but that seems to be a problem. So, if you'd like to elaborate on any of this, or specify,
Sure.
like, or even add other things, you know, like other
Yeah,
potential ways to go wrong.
yeah, sure. So, with with traditionalism, there's it's almost baked into it, but it's like a how do I say it? There's a glorification of the past, which tends to sort of put on rose-colored glasses, and it sort of overlooks the bad parts about anything that was in the past, while holding up the um, the good things as these pristine sort of like ideals. And that's kind of, it neglects the historical aspect to things. It also neglects the idea of development in the church. So historical forms get to the point that they get to um, through development, but also um, they're still human forms. They don't become like idealized in history. They can always improve. Um, so that's a basic error of just like glorifying something that's human and subject to historical contingencies. Um, Beyond that, there's also a tendency to um, sort of revert back to attitudes that don't serve the present moment. So I would think of something like uh, subjugation of women, taking away women's rights, saying women shouldn't be able to vote or shouldn't be able to work outside the home. Now, it's good if a woman can bear children and work within the home if a family um, provides that opportunity, if the husband can provide that opportunity. But to say it's a mortal sin to work outside the home is completely um, uh, wrong and also very harmful. Um, and then there's other things like anti-Semitism or um, racism or like the church the church had the Crusades, therefore um, violence is justified against non-Catholics, or it's okay to burn people at the stake because we did that in the past, or capital punishment is basically dogma because we did it for so long. These are historical contingencies, and in some cases, it was um, very far from the ideal, if not the opposite of an ideal, like things that Catholics shouldn't be doing but did in history, and therefore we glorify it as part of our tradition. John Paul II, in his encyclical on the third millennium, Tertio Adveniente, writes that we needed to, in order to have a successful or faithful um, third millennium, we really need to correct a lot of these harmful attitudes, and we need to sort of do penance for a lot of it because Catholics haven't been perfect in the past. And during the reign of Christendom, there were a lot of abuse and uh, offenses against human dignity and the way we should treat others made in the image of God who might not be Catholic. And in a pluralistic society that we have today, we really need to foster an attitude and an orientation towards others that is non-triumphalistic and can can sort of build up what John Paul II called a civilization of love. And that's how we incarnate the gospel in a pluralistic world. We don't need to hold the levers of power to do that. We don't need Christendom back to do that. We can have a civilization of love in a pluralistic society
Yeah,
by modeling for others, especially.
yeah, and it seems like uh, at least without judging people's hearts, it seems as if psychologically a big underlying motive for a lot of at least some of the more radical forms of traditionalism is this confusion of adherence to tradition with nostalgia. And I mean, it's interesting because I've even seen some people within these radical traditionalist group circles, like at least some of the thought leaders or some of the more intellectually sophisticated members, going, okay, what we want is the Latin Mass. We don't want to go back to the 1950s, And so even some of them are saying that, but I think that's almost like, you know, a point of nuance that is very often missed on the ground, because most people think that tradition simply means doing what was done in the past.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because, the ironically, you do see a little bit of certain, and we'll get into this maybe a little bit later on in the interview, but you see a little bit of this notion of there's certain tendencies that were normally associated with the theological left that even a lot of traditionalists were critical of, that then seeped into the traditionalist movement. And one, again, think about this false antiquarianism, this notion
Mhm.
of just because it was done in the past, then that means it was good. It seems as if traditionalism, and this is something that was touched on in the book, traditionalism almost has a naive and more intellectually simplistic version of that, where it tends to sort of confuse the ideal with, or with what you see in a lot of Latin Mass communities today, with
Mhm.
what was the issue with the way things were back in the 1950s or
Mhm.
before, the sort of things that motivated the council. So why do you
Yeah.
think there's a lot of people who, cross that line, or who have a difficult time knowing where the line is between nostalgia and tradition?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things behind this. One of the big ones I would say, and the reason traditionalism is so big in America is because we are living with even a lot of evangelical Protestants. The approach that they take to scripture with this sort of sola scriptura, sort of literalistic reading of the text, fundamentalism, if you want to call it that, um, that's been adopted by a lot of Catholics. So they see forms that have been handed on through the centuries and they call that tradition when really many of these things, like the traditional Latin Mass, which keep in mind is only a missal, it's the 62 missal. When people talk about the Latin Mass, they're talking about this missal, which has changed many times over the years, over the centuries. But they see this tradition handed on and they call that tradition with a capital T. It's really an ecclesial tradition, a lowercase t tradition, not to be equated with the tradition up one part of divine. So divine revelation, as Dave Verboom puts it, is made up of scripture and tradition and interpreted under the authority of Magisterial. And only the only authentic interpretation is the one that is in union with the Magisterium. So w- traditionalists will oftentimes they'll take these traditions and they'll hold them up as this golden standard. Um, but it's selective, and sometimes it's antiquarianism, and sometimes it's not enough reference to the past. So, like the traditional Latin Mass, the 1962 Missal, that's only 60 so years old. Um, but if you go back to the original Mass in the first 4 centuries, you'll see things like the presentation of the gifts. You'll see things like the kiss of peace. These are all things that are missing from the 1962 Missal, but they're very traditional elements. Um, Communion standing, and that's also very traditional. That's a hot button issue because people think it's sacrilegious for some reason, but it's an apostolic practice. So there's a little bit of antiquarianism in wanting to revert back to what their basic, like, most recent ancestors did, but then there's not really enough reference to what the church has allowed for through the centuries. Um, so they see the change that's developed, and they think that it's been sort of it's culminated in this golden ideal. And then once it reaches that ideal, it should no longer change. Um, but to get to that point, you should be able to recognize that it did change, and therefore it can change. And therefore, under the church's direction, whatever she has uh, issued in her disciplinary norms is normative for Catholics, and should be accepted with facility.
And so it's really a matter of, some people confusing certain historically contingent expressions of the faith with the substance of the faith itself, or
Right. So divine revelation, made up of scripture and tradition, ended with the death of the last apostle. So tradition, anything that's called tradition after that is not tradition with a capital T. It might be uh, it might be normative in a different way because the magisterium has interpreted um, interpreted tradition in such a way that led them to issue X disciplinary norm or X teaching. So the Immaculate Conception um, uh, or the Assumption, these are found in tradition, um, but the formulation itself is a matter of magisterial authority, not tradition,
yeah,
if
and
that
that's
makes
I
sense.
think, yeah, that's actually an important point of nuance. I think a lot of people, you know, that's very easy to lose in the midst of all of these debates. But I think the important thing to keep in mind in the midst of all of this is that, all was not well in the 1950s or in the 19th century or in the early modern era. There was certainly, I think there's a lot of elements of the preconciliar church as well as a lot of elements of the postconciliar church that were good, but certainly, things were not perfect in terms of how the faith was being implemented, even on an institutional level. So, what were the specific set of concerns, just to kind of talk about the flip side of it? What were the specific set of concerns that the church, that the Council Fathers at Vatican II had that motivated them to take part in these reforms?
Yeah. So the the Council Fathers at Vatican II were in large part responding to the loss of Christendom and the spread of new media form, new technologies, the spread of communism and atheism, scientism, the sexual revolution, which was just coming about. Um, so they had a lot to respond to, sort of chart a path for the church going forward. Some of these movements, like the sexual revolution, hadn't yet culminated, but they were still looking ahead. So Vatican II wasn't responding necessarily to questions that needed addressing in the 50s or 60s. Excuse me. Um, they were seeing trends and preparing the church for a new millennium. That's what a lot of Vatican II was about. Um, so that needs to be kept in mind. And then also, there were very particular questions like how should the church interact with non-Christians? How should it, what should be its response to pluralism? Should it allow religious liberty? Um, how should the church, how should the church's liturgy, should it use Latin still? Should it allow for vernacular? Should modern hymns be allowed? Should forms of, you know, different cultures, can that be acculturated into the liturgy? So they had a lot to respond to. Some of their concerns about things like losing Latin and chant might have been valid, and still are, but they they aren't. The way to address it is not just to say we need Latin because we had Latin or something. It's the church needs to find a way, if she wants to keep Latin, to incorporate it in a way that is pastorally sensitive, and also doesn't obscure the catechetical dimension that the Council Fathers wanted to see in liturgy, um, or the accessibility that they they wanted. So a lot of the changes around vernacular were due to wanting wanting to make the faith accessible to everyone. Latin was not yet dead at the time of Vatican II, but today it's not really taught in seminaries or Catholic schools to the extent that it's feasible to have it used extensively in the liturgy. Some proposals are more sound in that they suggest having it used for the ordinary parts, maybe the easier ordinary parts like the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei. Um, but things like the Creed in Latin, I don't think anyone is ready for that. A lot of people don't understand the terms we already use in the Creed in English.
Yeah.
If you ask your average person what filioque means,
Right.
or most of them aren't going to understand what it means.
Yeah.
So
Well,
there's a lot of these like really nuanced questions, and it's not as black and white as simply liberalism came in, crowded out our traditional practices, therefore we need to react and take them back. It's not that simple. And the attempt at just turning it into this culture war fight.
I'm sorry, but can you repeat that last part again? I think you kind of cut out a little bit.
Culture war,
Hold on a sec. So I think, hold on a second. Am I still coming in on? Yeah. Hold on a sec. So let me just. Sorry about that. Let me just. So I'm just gonna do some. So am I coming in on your end?
yeah.
Oh yeah, awesome. You're coming in on my end. So, but I think we got most of your answer. But I think everything you just said sort of leads to another. Well, I think there's another important element here, and that is a lot of it seems to be concerned with the desire for renewal, right? For spiritual and moral renewal in the church. So it seems like you could talk about these specific issues, ecumenism, just the more general issues of modernity, the use of Latin, but also seems like there was just a response to a more general, not as easily quantifiable set of issues, a lot of which had to do with the concept of renewal.
Mhm.
So what is it that, how is the concept of renewal understood by a lot of the council fathers, and what specifically did they have in mind when they said, a lot of our reforms are meant to promote renewal in the church?
So when renewal is it's an interesting word because when the council fathers issued their documents, Lumen Gentium in particular, and Apostolicum Actuositatem, I think it's the Latin. Um, they wanted to see a renewal of the church in its self-understanding. The church had become somewhat stagnant, somewhat very clerical oriented. Um, Renewal didn't just mean more dynamism in the same model that had been practiced. It was sort of bringing the council wanted to bring about of the church, but not a new church, but a new way of orienting the church. So participation of the laity, especially uh, with the universal call to holiness. Um, that was maybe that was maybe one of the top like 3 or 5 things that the council brought about. Um, people like to blame the Second Vatican Council for the vocations crisis we saw. A lot of the fallout of the priesthood and religious life after the council, but it doesn't take into account the fact that there was a whole new um, sort of vocation in the church of the laity also being involved in things like being theologians. There weren't many theologians in the church prior to Vatican II, members of the laity. Um, so, so just like there's been an explosion of lay ministries in the church after Vatican II because of Vatican II. That when we look at the vocations crisis, we don't sufficiently take that into account. A lot of the clergy's roles were being replaced by the laity. It's not that we just saw a fallout of the priesthood. It's we saw a reduction in the priesthood, but we also saw an increase in the role of the laity. So it's sort of in some way it brings a greater balance because both lay and clergy are both now fulfilling their respective roles more fully. Um, and it also delegated a lot of uh, non-sacramental roles of the clergy to laity. So now it's lay people conducting Bible studies and lay people writing theology books and doing all of these things that in the past it would only be clergy doing it. So it freed up the clergy for a lot more sacramental duties, um, but it also made a lot less of them necessary. Um, which that's not to say we still don't have enough, but it is to say that the what it means to be a member of the clergy has somewhat changed because they don't necessarily need to fulfill all of those extra sacramental duties that they used to fulfill in the past. So it really, but it also clarifies the identity of the priesthood and religious life because now priesthood and religious life can be focused more on what's essential to their core rather than fulfilling these other ministries they were only filling because lay people weren't yet very involved in the life of the church.
Yeah. And so I guess this leads to a broader question on what is the relationship. I mean, obviously, a big um, motivation behind the council was the desire to bring about renewal. Another big element of the council was the desire to bring about reforms that would then facilitate that renewal. But where exactly do we draw the line between renewal on the one hand and um, deviation from tradition on the other? Because I think you see the rise of this more moderate stance in Catholicism that rejects both radical traditionalism and liberalism. But I think the one thing that most people in the church, outside of the most extreme liberals, would agree upon is we need to uphold tradition. But there's also a need for reform at times. So where does reform drift into deviation from the norm? And what is it that you think some radical traditionalists are missing when they talk about Vatican II as if it's a deviation and not a reform, at least in terms of like the actual like what the council is recommending.
Right. So it basically comes down to, is the reform issued by the magisterial authority, or is it some sort of like attempt at rogue, sort of like um, rogue ideologues pushing. Um, if it's something issued by magisterial authority, then it's a authentic reform mission, because the magisterium has authentic interpretive role of tradition. Like it's up to the magisterium to decide tradition and what. Um, so if the magisterium issues a reform, you can trust that it's trustworthy, or you can know that it's trustworthy, um, because the church is indefectible and it can't issue uh, teaching, formal teachings or disciplines that are either heretical or spiritually dangerous and unsafe. That goes with the promise Christ gave to the church to not let the gates of hell prevail against it. It also goes along with Christ's promise to send the Holy Spirit to guide the church at Pentecost. Um, so, so the church needs to be thought of as trustworthy, and that's a big part of overcoming this crisis of trust and this crisis of faith. Is there's a lot of cynicism in the church right now. There's a lot of distrust of authority, especially following the sex abuse crisis, that needs to be recovered. And denigrating the bishops, constantly bashing the Pope, um, clickbait headlines, sensationalism, all of this culminates in creating um, an unworkable environment for the magisterium to operate effectively. And if you want the church to be cohesive as the body of Christ, to be effective in the world, um, it needs to be it needs there needs to be this relation between the authority of the church and the faithful that is one of um, respect, mutual understanding, um, and on the faithful's end, it needs to be um, trust in the church's guidance and the mission of intellect and will to its teaching. Yeah,
And so this actually leads to a very important point, because obviously the whether it be the bishops, the college of bishops in general, or the pope in specific, or a council, they were obviously given this magisterial authority, and with it, the protection of the Holy Spirit. And so all Catholics recognize the need to assent, both in mind and in will, to the teachings of the Church, even when it's non-infallible or non-definitive. But this, I think, leads to two issues. And I think one issue that a traditionalist will raise is that there was a certain value to some of the things that we saw before the council. Some of it may have been unworkable, but some of it did still have value and could still in some way have relevance. And so I think there's a little bit of a belief among some traditionalist circles that they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so
sure.
very clearly the church would never. I mean, I don't think the church was condemning the preconciliar liturgy as evil, because you can't. The church would never condemn as evil something that it once approved as good. But also at the same time, the church would never, approve of something that is evil. So the church wouldn't have created and promulgated, or at the very least permitted the use of the Novus Ordo if it was bad or spiritually dangerous. And this is something that you just pointed out. But some people would say, okay, we can admit that, but it wasn't that, maybe the something about the council itself may have been a little bit overzealous. I mean, there may have been some things in the pre-conciliar church that were worth preserving that weren't being preserved. How do you speak to that concern for a lot
Yeah.
of traditionalists?
Well, so that there's a couple ways to look at it. One of them is a lot of the major changes were discussed at the council, um, and they were discussed by all of the world bishops. Um, so even if we those decisions, they they were they were considered. Both sides of was considered, and a decision was made. And that comes down to just like, will I accept the decision, magisterium, or not? Um, there are other changes though which weren't considered at the council, which were uh, later addressed either by the Pope himself, um, or by the Concilium liturgy. There was the Concilium established sixth, which made specific changes regarding Gregorian Latin vernacular versus populum, um, and things like whether we were going to have a freestanding altar. Like those were changes that came about after the council, but were also considered extensively. Um, Now there are other things which just sort of faded out of practice, which traditionalists, as long as it's not opposed to church authority, are still free to practice. Um, Ember days, for example, not be included in revised Roman Epistle, but you're still free to practice. Um, you're still free to practice a 3 hour fast before communion. It's not required. Um, you can still do these traditional things, which um, there's nothing against it. But there's also the question of um, whether some of these practices line up with the theology by the council, um, or maybe encapsulated by. So with here's an um, the church sort of wanted freestanding with versus popular, because it balanced out the sacrificial dimension of the liturgy aspect and traditionalists often see this as a liturgy, but it it's really a balance of all the different aspects of the liturgy. So the sacrifice is still present, but now the meal aspect is clear. Um, but if you want to do ad orientem, still welcome. That's not been written, but the general instruction says, versus populum. It says a freestanding altar is preferred. Some people, I personally also include populum as preferred, because they wouldn't the general instruction wouldn't for a standing altar unless it was also right populum logically. Um, but it doesn't forbid adoration. You can still do that, but I don't think personally. I think the meal and the sacrament were intended to be um, just about Christ's death on the cross, um, his life. It's the whole paschal mystery, and then there's other changes in the liturgy, like communion versus the general instruction in the U.S. has standing as the norm, but you're free to, the church wants to encourage standing. The former instruction of general instruction um, said if the faithful for communion, they be catechized about the norm. They're to do that. Um, and this goes all the way back to Nicaea, which Nicaea forbid kneeling during communion because it's seen as a penitential act. Whereas when you're receiving communion, sort of like that's the culmination of the wedding feast. You don't do penance on Easter, basically, is the idea
Yeah.
behind it. So standing is the norm in the US now. But you're still free to kneel. There's been recent controversies over in Austin, Texas, and in Charlotte, they've removed altar rails, or they've removed the prie-dieux, so the faithful have a more difficult time. Um, but you're still allowed to, if you want. But the church is kind of trying to be clear that these changes aren't arbitrary. They've been well thought out. Even if the more traditional, quote unquote, traditional practice is kneeling because it was around for, I think, I think it came about in the 8th century and it lasted all the way up until the 1900s. Kneeling was the norm, or 20th century. Um, but it doesn't mean it's better just because it lasted longer. We don't know when the end of the world is. So the world could go on for another 5,000 years and practice might be 800 years old. But if the church has decided to change it, and in 2,000 years, standing could have been around long, or
Yeah.
so we can't.
Yeah.
The chronological argument isn't a great argument. It ultimately comes down to church authority, and we can't. If you've discounted church authority, you're leaving it up to subjective judgment, which isn't great. Like that's basically a Protestant.
Yeah, but everything you just said was actually very. I think you raised a lot of important points about how just because something is an old practice doesn't necessarily mean it's the best practice or the practice officially approved by the church. What do you think is the best way to sort of separate an adherence to tradition with trying to separate tradition from certain types of historical baggage?
Yeah, I think our approach to this has to be epistemological first. So epistemologically, we know that revelation is mediated through the magisterium, and um, our first obligation is to the church's um, uh, decisions about what tradition entails, and to its authority. So we have to adhere to the church's authority first and foremost. Um, as St. Paul said, I think it was in the letter to Timothy, or I could be wrong about that, but it's he said the pillar and foundation of truth is what?
The church.
The church, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So, and scripture wasn't around yet at the time. Um, I mean, we had like the letter to Timothy, of course, but scripture wasn't canonized at that point. Tradition wasn't yet a thing. Um, the guiding authority of the church, of the people of God, I would say, is the church. It's the magisterial authority. Um, and so our first obligation is to the church and its authority, and then under that rubric, we can decide if we want to implement this or that practice, if it's still allowed. If it's not allowed, ultimately we defer to the church to make that judgment about what should be allowed and what shouldn't be.
Yeah.
It's a respectful deference. It might not be our preference, but Um, if we're going to call ourselves Catholic, that's an obligation that's incumbent on us to first um, give assent to the church, and then within what it allows, we have a wide range of options. But we can't disregard or reject what the church has taught for the sake of our preferences or for the sake of what we think should be an option, which the church has said is no longer an option.
Yeah. And I guess this actually leads to sort of the flip side of this, which is that, some people may, I mean, obviously you have, certain parts of church teaching that are, infallible. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum would be, less formal decrees from the church or sort of like just sort of preaching from the podium or when someone gives a private theological opinion. So there's obviously degrees
Mm-hmm.
of authority, but I was speaking, reading something from one friend, and he had said, "Well, the concept of infallibility promises the church will never be wrong. It never promises that when the church says something, it's going to always say it in the clearest or most direct way possible, and it's not promising that every single leader throughout the church is going to implement church teaching in the most in the best way possible. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's a lot of people who had concerns about how a certain part of church teaching was being interpreted, being implemented, sort of vague ways in which it was worded, and then they just sort of maybe from over time drifted into a more radical position. But where does a person draw the line? And I think a lot of the debate also comes down to, I think, one, authority, but I think also secondly, where does one know where to draw the line between um, criticizing misleading ways in which church teaching is articulated, or maybe imprudent ways in which church teaching is being implemented,
Mm-hmm.
versus just outright challenging the authority of the church?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, when it comes to the way that church teaching is um, being implemented or uh, sort of taught by theologians or by non-magisterial figures, um, the approach the faithful should have there is always to refer back to the magisterium. Um, if their bishop is doing something that's out of line with the magisterium, then you have a certain obligation to your bishop, but you have a higher obligation to the magisterium. Now, people say, well, what if the magisterium is doing something that's out of line with what God wants? That same argument doesn't hold when it comes to the magisterium, because the magisterium is the arbiter and mediator and interpreter of scripture and tradition. So what the magisterium issues is what God wants, unless unless the Pope as a private person is telling you to sin or something. But when it comes to formal teaching, if it's a magisterial decree, if it's included in the Apostolica Acta Apostolica Sedis, if it's on the Vatican website, we can be pretty sure that it's magisterial.
Yeah,
And so there's no excuse for opposing something like that. Now, you brought up another good point, which is it doesn't mean that the teaching is always the best it could be, but that doesn't give you a right to dissent from it. You have to accept what the magisterium teaches as your baseline, and then you can expand on that. You could possibly improve on it, but you can't discard it in order to do something, in order to take a different approach and sort of like make up your own teaching
yeah,
because the magisterium's teaching didn't fit your uh, standards or whatever.
yeah. And so I guess this leads to like another important point that was actually also frequently kind of referenced in the book, that people tend to confuse politics and theology. And on
Hmm.
some level, I think that makes sense. I mean, obviously, the teachings of the church are not, liberal or conservative, but
Hmm.
I think there are certain elements of church teaching that would lead people to believe that, oh, the church is conservative or the church is liberal. Think about, for example, the church's support of more traditional kind of social values, its defense of marriage, and all that. But then on the other hand, think of the strong emphasis on helping the poor, and its simultaneous criticisms of both communism and socialism,
Hmm.
as well as some of the excesses in capitalism. So even within its
Right.
economic teachings, even within the same economic document, you can focus on certain things and say, oh, well, the church is liberal or the church is conservative.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's nothing wrong with being conservative or liberal politically, um, insofar as you're interpreting that ideology through the lens of Catholicism.
Right.
But I think a lot of people tend to confuse the different levels of meaning of the terms conservative or liberal. A
Hmm.
lot of people tend to think that theological conservatism or theological liberalism are always, interchangeable with political conservatism or political liberalism. And once people start to have a leaning towards a specific interpretation of Catholicism, this then leads to an endorsement of a political ideology, which then ends up getting read back into the
Yeah.
Magisterium. Now, sometimes this works in our favor. Think about people who get super deep into an ideology and then it leads them back into the church.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, but what happens is that runs a lot of risks of using the political ideology as the lens through which to interpret you know, tradition instead of using tradition as the framework to interpret an ideology.
Yeah.
And I think, you see a lot of people who, you know, have this stereotype of what Dorothy Day is like. And so they think, oh, well, if I'm kind of lean more towards that, then I should be, a liberal. Or they maybe
Hmm.
lean a little more conservative and they say, oh, well, you know, let's, I liked the Latin Mass or architecture that looks like this because it's, based in red pilled or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think there's, how do you draw, because I think a lot of it is, people get deep into a particular ideology that causes them to interpret the faith a certain way, and then they end up, when the faith doesn't live up to their expectations, then this ends up causing a lot of issues. And I think you do see
Yeah.
that on the right when people sort of interpret even the concept of traditionalism in light of reactionary politics. So
Right.
what do you say is the best tool to sort of prevent the church from becoming, or specific interpretations of church teaching from becoming subservient to politics,
Yeah.
and to kind of you know prevent the sort of polarization that we see in political discourse from undermining the sort of theological discourse that we see in the church?
Yeah. So I think it some of it comes down to not idolizing politics. I think that's an easy thing to do, especially when it's on our TVs 24/7. Um, so the number one thing I would say is not idolizing it. Um, and also like we can't make politics part of our identity the same way we make Catholicism part of our identity. Um, our our uh, our citizenship is in heaven at, at the end of the day, or at the end of our lives, rather. But there is a social aspect to Catholicism also, which politics can speak to. Um, but it's our faith that is meant to inform our politics and not vice versa. Um, now, something you said right at the beginning, where it's you know you might be more socially liberal if you prioritize the poor, or you prioritize immigrants or the marginalized, or maybe more conservative if you are focused on defending the family. But it's not an either or, and it can't be an either or. It has to be both. And the principle of Catholicism, almost the principle of Catholicism, is its universality. It's both and. So we need to prioritize immigrants and the family, defense of traditional values, and also openness to improvements on things. Some people, traditionalists, tend to think if you talk about progress, you must be a progressive. It's like, no, progress is a good thing. Tradition is also a good thing. The two aren't in conflict. Progress refines the good elements of tradition, and it makes tradition stand more clearly because it accentuates the good that has been passed down, and it strips away the contingent historical elements and the negative aspects which have sort of clouded over those good things that we've handed down. So progress and tradition go hand in hand, and we need to be very clear about that. So that's number one. Number two is, it might seem easier to, let's say, prioritize marriage and the family, because marriage is the core of society, and the poor and the immigrant and the outcast are on the margins of society. So it would seem like, oh, because they're on the margins, they're a more marginal issue. But that's the wrong way to look at it too. It's fostering the common good is inclusive of everyone. The family might be the core of society, but the poor is the core of the gospel. So you have to sort of prioritize the poor in the way you structure society. There's a preferential option for the poor. You have to create a society that's open and welcoming to strangers. So the way you build up society, the way you build up the family, is to instill gospel values in the family that treat these people on the margins and the poor and the outcast, treat them with respect and humanity. And then you will see a reduction in crime, and you'll see things that, like, when you prioritize the poor, you also strengthen families.
Yeah. And I feel like that more nuanced approach, was something that the council was, what I think in many ways trying to get at. Unfortunately, I don't think that was necessarily something that came through in a lot of the popular ways the council was presented and implemented. And I think this sort of leads to, I think, the last major question or set of questions I think we can analyze, and that a lot of them revolve around the question of, where do we go from here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because back in the 60s, the 70s, some of this carried over into the 80s, but you begin to see the changes even then, of, this sort of extreme interpretation in one way of the council, which overlooked a lot of the nuance. And frankly, I mean, I think if people had been saying all along and presenting the council with the same level of nuance that you had just presented right now, I think we would have been able to avoid a lot of the issues that we currently see in the church. But the issue is that, it's not, I would argue, it's not the council, but it's the way the council was interpreted. And when it comes to the way the council was implemented, it wasn't even so much the way the council was implemented in terms of, the what was officially mandated or permitted, but the way the average person on the ground was doing a lot of things. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people saw that and they thought that there was a lot of stuff that was lost. Now, first of all, I'd like to know maybe your opinions on that in terms of what is attributable to the reality on the ground and what is attributable to certain ambiguities coming from the higher ups.
Mm-hmm.
But this sort of also leads to the flip side is because I think somewhere along the line someone dropped the ball that seemed to give credence to a lot of people among the traditionalists. And I think among the younger generations of priests, you're starting to see this like people wanting sort of what we once had,
Mm-hmm.
which I think, you know, kind of presses the question even more and makes these sorts of discussions even more, you know, even more important, in terms of like a message to these younger generations of priests, let's say in the 40 and younger or 30 and younger crowd. You can have, devotion, like reverence and devotion to liturgy and a sense of transcendence and beauty and
Mm-hmm.
even a traditional way of doing things without overlooking the sorts of overlooking nuance that would lead to, you know, a person becoming a radical traditionalist. So where for these up and coming generations of priests and even just faithful more generally who are looking for who are thirsty for beauty and reverence and tradition, what would be the best piece of advice for them to keep in mind in order to know how to pursue those things without throwing the baby out with the bathwater in the opposite direction, in terms of not rejecting the authority of the council or anything good in the council for the sake of what they see as the ideal,
Yeah.
liturgically or spiritually?
Yeah.
I know that's
Um,
a lot there, but
yeah, I'll do the first part of your question first. I might need a refresher on the second, but I'll try to hit both. Um, so the first thing I would say is the the texts of Vatican II, especially like the main texts, they're constitutions. There's four constitutions. Um, Constitutions by definition need an interpreter. So you can't take the approach of it's like a sola scriptura, but with the texts of Vatican II. It's like Sacrosanctum Concilium said this, therefore this. It's like it said Latin has or Gregorian chant has pride of place. Therefore, if we don't see Gregorian chant, that means it's an abuse. That's the wrong way of looking at it because um, the council documents were issued, and then Paul VI established a concilium to interpret and implement the documents, and they produced five interpretive texts to interpret Sacrosanctum Concilium, and then they also issued the Roman Missal. And so those are the normative, interpretive lenses through which to view the council's document on the liturgy. But on top of that, we also have the Pope and the bishops in communion with him to serve as a continuing sort of juridical voice to continue to interpret them. Um, and people get scared when you talk about interpreting something that seems fixed, as if that's theological liberalism. But no, if you're interpreting a legal document, there needs to be an active agent as well as the text itself. That's always the case with any type of um, legal document. So so that's the first thing, and then the second thing is as far as how do Catholics who love tradition maintain these things, I would say the best thing they could do is to live them as well as they can. So if you want Gregorian chant, make an effort to either foster it in your own parish. That's an easy thing to do. It might not be you singing, but maybe you can help organize a scola. You might not have the gift of singing, but you can do something. And that might be just assisting your pastor or assisting the music director, or it might be if you have the financial means, maybe it means helping to fund the sacred music program. Um, there's a lot of ways to support these traditional elements, but the other principle which I want to point out is that you have to do so with a spirit of detachment and a spirit of submission. Because if you don't have those two elements, then what you love has become an idol, and the magisterium is not interested in having faithful members of the church who are attached to idols. So if the magisterium has to strip away something that's a lowercase t tradition in order to foster a more detached spirit among the faithful, then it's willing to do so because ultimately we're not called to be attached to anything in this world. Um, Now, that doesn't mean that good things, good traditional things don't have their place. They do, but they can't become idols. And that's something we need to really um, address in our personal lives as well as within these polarizing debates surrounding tradition. It's these things are good. They can help foster the faith until they don't. And if they don't, then they're a distraction and they're getting in the way of your relationship with Christ and his church.
And so, what do you say that, and again, there's a lot, obviously, a lot of ways we could approach this issue, but could you say that there's a difference between, I prefer Gregorian chant, I don't like the very clear cases of liturgical abuse. Maybe the church should honor its heritage by having more Gregorian chant, and then Gregorian chant is a good way to sort of keep, the sort of liturgical abuse at bay, to sort of curtail that. So I like this legitimate good thing. I don't like this legitimate bad thing, versus saying I like this legitimate good thing and then this other legitimate good thing that's just different. So it can, like the Novus Ordo proper, not puppet mass, but like an actual, like a Novus Ordo Misse as it is performed the way it's supposed to be performed,
Right.
as opposed to, and then on the other hand, a Latin mass performed as it's supposed to be performed. A
Mhm.
balanced approach would say both of those are good. You could even say both of those have their place in the church, but then as opposed to, some people would say no, because I like one, the other has to go. And
Yeah.
so, could you say that the lack of attachment is basically not, and I just want to make sure I'm clarifying what you're saying. It's not that it's a bad thing to be attached to the Latin Mass, but it's saying I'm attached to a specific liturgical expression that makes me think that any other liturgical expression that's been officially approved by the church, in spite of the fact that it's been approved by the church, is bad.
Well, it's it's possible to have a inordinate attachment to a disordered or inordinate attachment to um, traditions or particular preferences of you know
Yeah,
particular preferences you have. So that's possible. If you do have preferences, that's fine,
yeah,
but you should recognize them as preferences.
exactly.
And
As
when you
opposed to
dog,
being mandated.
sorry,
As opposed to things that are mandated.
right. So you shouldn't be dogmatizing things that are disciplines. Um, when you do that, that's when the magisterium tends to take them away and say, look, it's not dogmatic, and we just prove that it wasn't by taking it away. Um, the faithful have a sort of a duty um, to how do I say this? The faithful are well within their rights to have their preferences and to celebrate those preferences, provided provided it's within the limits of the law. Um, when you want to impose those preferences on other people, especially when that imposition would be contrary to both the principle of non-coercion and then also the principle that there's the church allows for a legitimate diversity of practices, um, then you've overstepped your bounds and you are functioning as sort of you're not helping the church. You're sort of proselytizing just with liturgical preferences instead
Yeah.
of the gospel.
Yeah. And so it's, you know, then, and it kind of seems like this is another major theme in your book of we have to think with the mind of the church, you
Yeah,
know, and we have to recognize that anything that's been approved by the church is not like we like by definition, like if you understand the Catholic view and the magisterium, you and I are not in a position to condemn that which the church has either approved or permitted. And so it
right,
could be, and I think this is what a lot of people overlook. It's legitimate to say, I like the Latin Mass, but you can't say, I, I think that the new Mass is bad. Because nothing that's been approved by the church, at least not when it's done properly,
right,
can never by definition be bad or fail to produce spiritual fruit.
right.
That's like the point of nuance that a lot of people overlook, right?
Yeah, right,
Yeah. And so, that's, I think if a person enters into it with that mindset, I mean, there can be, again, within a certain very limited range, a certain diversity, but the diversity is like new mass versus old mass, Eastern liturgy versus Western liturgy. The diversity is not like when I say like if I were to say the new mass is invalid, nothing the church approves is invalid by
right.
definition.
Yeah,
So, and it's also again, putting myself in place as if I'm the ultimate liturgical authority.
yeah.
You know, but I guess it's
Or
sort of
or even if it comes down to like the 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 Novus Ordo is valid, but it's imprudent. You're still taking upon yourself a role of judgment about what is prudent for the universal church. That's not your judgment to make.
yeah. And there's also the question of okay, so the broad question of how do I use church teaching to determine what is the most prudent decision, but then you also have the notion of, well, am I sure I'm taking into account every single element of every single possible situation?
Right.
You know, and again,
And
I'm
you
not.
don't, as a layperson, you don't have that vantage point.
Yeah. And again, not to say that anyone can have quite literally, this is getting on a little bit of a tangent of epistemology, not to say everyone has every piece of information, but isn't that aren't there processes in the church that the church is supposed to use to make sure it gets the widest array of information
Right.
when determining this sort of decision,
Right. Right. So it has the sensus fidelium, it has synodality, it has the College of Bishops and Cardinals to consult with, and then ultimately, once all of that has culminated, it goes up to the Pope and he makes a decision. And that decision is binding upon the church. And there's no there's no way of it does come back to epistemology because there's no way to know once all of that has occurred uh, whether the Pope made a wrong decision or a right decision, except by way of historical retrospection. Um, but only a pope can judge another pope,
Yeah.
um, and we can assume by the fact that it's gone through all this process that it was the best available decision at the time, at the very least. So it's okay to advocate for a different decision, but it's not okay to advocate um, for a different decision while undermining the current decision that's been made.
Yeah. and I guess this is, and I always try to end these interviews with a very specific, uh, like a variant of this sort of question. But obviously, we're living in, through interesting times in the church, and we're trying to preserve the perennial beauty of Catholicism, while also bringing it into the third millennium of trying to find ways to make modern man better understand the perennial beauty of the church, try to find ways to present it to him that can sort of, draw him in. And
Mhm.
there's this desire. People tend to be are trying to maintain this balancing act between recognizing and adhering to this perennial tradition of the church, and then trying to more effectively evangelize. And I think so. There's the issue of authority, but there's also, I think, that issue as well. How do you maintain that balancing act between more effective evangelization and, adherence to the sort of perennial beauties and truths of the faith, which
Sure.
leads to which I guess, as we, and again, this has been something we've been debating for the past 50, 60 years, but based on what you've heard from other scholars and more popular apologists, based on your own research, based on your analysis of both history and church teaching, what would be your biggest piece of advice for people attempting sort of make that balancing act and trying to move forward in a way faithful to church teaching in the midst of all of this craziness?
Yeah. Um, that's a tough question. When you were talking, there was a couple things that came to mind. One of them is if you're evangelizing, you're trying to bring people into the church. You're trying to bring people ultimately into a church that is in submission to the Roman pontiff. If you're not if you're trying to bring people into a church that is not in submission to the pontiff, then you're not bringing them into the Catholic Church. You might be bringing them into an ideological factionalism that calls itself Catholic, but the the church that is Catholic is under the Pope. So when we evangelize, we have to keep these things in mind. And that I think comes down to having a sort of inner coherence between the way we live the faith, the way we evangelize, and the way we think about the faith. We have to sort of take the time, and this involves prayer, it involves reflection, but take the time to consider the ways you relate to your faith and the way you evangelize, and try to see where things line up and where they don't, and try to bring them in line with each other. Because if you're evangelizing by way of denigrating other religions, um, or by like by sort of glorifying the Crusades as like that's the if you're like trying to paint a picture of like that's the golden age of evangelization, is us conquering these other religions or lands, or, you know
Yeah.
how does that square with the magisterium's view of the Crusades and the way that it views some of the atrocities that were committed in the name of Christ? How does the way we bring people into the church, if we're doing that by way of anti-Semitism and saying that, um, I don't even want to say anything that is negative in order to prove my point.
Yeah.
Um, but we can't at one time denigrate Jews and Muslims and at the same time be trying to bring them into a church which in its teachings, in its documents, says we need to respect the faith of other believers in the Abrahamic religions. So we need to be internally consistent on this point. I think that's one of the big challenges today when we have so many ideological sort of flashpoints of like, oh, the Jews are doing this, or Muslims are invading Europe, or whatever. Like, it's framed in these culture war. It has this culture war framing, which doesn't take into account what the church has actually said about these religions and has said about the way we are to treat them. And it's sort of like, it's like do it yourself evangelization is the
Yeah.
alternative. And that's not a way to do evangelization, because you're not actually introducing people to what the church actually teaches. You might be introducing them to Christ, but you're not sort of, you're also creating resistance and skepticism, and you're fomenting that in the converts you're bringing in. So you're radicalizing them as you're bringing them in, and eventually that's going to erupt when they come into contact with church teaching, and they're going to reject it, and then they're going to become some little faction within the church which rejects part of its teaching while claiming to be the true church because we do things in a way that we've decided is the right way of doing it.
Yeah. And so at the end of the day, what I was going to end with this note. I had a professor of history when I was in college, where whenever we would talk about a particularly contentious point in American history, would say, we've been through this before, and we're going to be through it inevitably again. And there was never a point in church history when there wasn't, these intense debates on how to confront the issues of the time, but the Holy Spirit always, brought us through. And I think
Mhm.
that's the main thing that we need to remember here is that as the church, since the council has attempted to confront the issues of the modern world, it hasn't been easy to sort of properly and consistently implement what we know we should be doing, but where the fact that we're even just having these discussions is a sign that people drawing are starting to really think deeply about what the council actually said and the best way to implement it and the best way to sort of step up to the problems of the time. And it's a sign that the Holy Spirit is always at work. He was at work at the council, he was at work before the council, he was at work after the council, and he's going to see us through. So
Mhm.
with that in mind, I just have to say thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today. Hopefully, we can have a similar discussion in the future, and God bless.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Take
All
care.
right. Thanks.